Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. I'm with Pete here, who is doing exceptionally well in FPL this season. I think he has a rank of around 300 to 400, that kind of territory. And he's done exceptionally well off of the back of the kind of Game Week 7 wild card, where I think the choice move that he made was to move deeply into these kind of fullbacks that we've recognized over the course of the season as being premium assets, I think, over some midfielders that we were kind of tailing our teams around. And now heading into kind of Game Week 12, we're looking at, Pete fielding a back five. So what do you actually think about your team this week?
Um, just want to quickly shout out Fran's Discord. Yeah, we all speak in there, and that's how we all met. And yeah, in terms of my team, you'll probably see it in a sec, but the layout at the moment, it's got a back five, and it's the first time in my 4 years of playing FPL that I've fielded a back five. At the moment, it's James, Chilwell, Cancelo, Trent, and then Livramento. And I'm very confident with four, and then Livramento is probably, I would say, a ceiling of 7 points, maybe a clean sheet and a bonus point. And the toss-up is him or Raphinha, but
Yeah.
yeah, I'm fairly confident. I'm not terrified of the opposition in terms of what people will be able to field instead of that.
Yeah. I think that's right. So personally, like on my team, the deliberation was between Livramento, Benrahma, and Raphinha. And I kind of have a similar order with you with Livramento playing and then Raphinha on the bench. I guess my question would be more towards the Raphinha to Benrahma, and I'm probably one of the players who's still found a way to keep Benrahma on the team. Not willingly though. Obviously, he's someone I would like to get out, probably for Bowen in the near future, or maybe just for someone like Gallagher. But this week, of course, is probably still a great week to field these defenders, and I think as we've discussed so far, it's a tough week for Chelsea, but there's a reason why you're keeping these two premium defenders on the pitch, right?
Yeah, I was just explaining to Fran, I think it was 2 years ago, Trent played Leicester, who were at that point, I think, second or third in the league, perhaps third, and he scored 24 points. I think during the season, people like Salah just scored 12, 13 points against City. These two Chelsea centre backs look like they're starting, and I think between them both, they've scored 6 goals in 4 games. So it's yeah, you're working off a clean sheet potential as well as a lot of goal threat. So probably the second best defense in the league, I think. And yeah, mix that in with attack wing backs that have been told to score goals. I think yeah, got to start them if you've got them.
Yeah, I mean, I think like James has exceptionally great like kind of um, shot metrics as well, just in general, which means that maybe he makes a lot more sense than Chilwell, who's probably looking to kind of maybe is arguably a bit more clinical. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think James has probably a little bit more of a more kind of forward skill set where he's scoring these kind of volleys and things like that, and Chilwell's kind of scoring these kind of elegant placed shots. But James has the underlying stats where he's shooting a lot more and also maybe even crossing a bit more, which we'll see, what that kind of impact is when Lukaku comes back, because I think Lukaku's fit as well, which will be quite an interesting thing. Leicester as well this season have been extremely poor defensively, and yeah, I think clean like we traditionally look at defenders with clean sheets, but it's gone to the point where, I mean, when you look at the numbers these defenders are pulling out, it makes sense to actually just compare them straight, just from an attacking point of view, with these midfielders. What do you think about actually dropping Raphinha though? Like just in terms of, because he's exceptionally in form, still doing well for Brazil, but Leeds have been for the most part pretty terrible, and I think we do see them falter versus these big sides with good enough offenses to crumple them.
Yeah, so I think Leeds last year were really easy to buy because one, they were slightly cheaper, and two, they were getting more possession. They were actually dominating possession against good teams, and because of that, even if you had somebody who wasn't very clinical, they were going to score.
Yeah.
So it was actually very easy to double up. There was really not much risk.
Hmm.
At the moment, they're much less intense, and I think it's because they relied on Calvin Phillips, who's now back. But when they were dispossessed, they because they rely on having high possession, they were just getting broken apart and getting very tired from having to earn the ball back. So I think I've had to rely on Raphinha scoring kind of like very situational goals to get the points that they have now. So I
Yeah,
think Raphinha is fine to sell. Long story short, I
yeah,
think he's a really good player, and I think Leeds have the potential to bounce back. But they've got Tottenham this game, and then they've got a few other fixtures that aren't fantastic. So without that possession and that intensity, then it's difficult to back a team that relies on volume to get goals. So I'd say sell him, which I think a lot of people say he's the best price player in the game. Him or
yeah.
potentially Jota
Yeah, I think at the start of the season,
and
that was
James,
definitely the
maybe
case.
James.
Yeah, James is a new one. But I think, yeah, at the start of the season, it was always the question of whether you go for someone like Ben Rama, who was in form in the preseason, or you just go for Raphinha, who seems like a set and forget for the rest of the year. And probably he is. But I think now we've entered the place where, with I think Pep also making or kind of sticking to the same lineup game to game, you actually have like options of actually keeping a Man City midfielder. Then Jota makes kind of holds a position in your team, and it seems like a lot of people have still gone for Son ultimately over Kane, just due to budgeting and things like that, and that leaves you with less kind of space to have Raphinha in your team because he still is slightly expensive compared to someone like Gallagher and Smith Rowe, and I think that's the weird position that he finds himself in, especially as he heads into a slightly tougher fixture run. Um, how do you feel about maybe looking at the kind of team stats so far and maybe kind of reviewing? We're kind of at the 1/3 point in the season, or approaching it really, and I think it's a good kind of moment in time to actually look at what makes teams exciting from a defensive and offensive point of view, and just overall, how well they've performed, and maybe whether or not we can actually consider more assets from them. So I've actually created a kind of chance of winning statistic. Um, so this kind of looks at betting odds and aggregating how much a team has been expected to win over the course of the season. So for me, this is a nice way to actually show maybe fixture difficulty for each team. So you'll see, for example, a team like Crystal Palace is in the bottom 5 for kind of fixture difficulty. A part of that too is, of course, just the fact that they're not expected to do well. So we kind of have sides like Leicester, who probably have dropped a little bit further off as the season has gone on, and the betting odds have changed. Leeds is someone who I think we don't expect to see in the top half based on how they've actually played, but it shows that the historic preferences over the kind of bookies have kind of made them favor Leeds a little bit, whereas Brighton, we see them more around that kind of top half of the table now because they've done so well and finally kind of started to outperform some of their underlying stats. But I think, how do you think the fixture difficulty has impacted like the way you've chosen some assets in FPL? Are you more of a kind of form of fixtures guy or fixtures over form?
I'm actually, I think, to be honest, I think there's a couple exceptions, but there are generally. So you've got to. I think some of the main points earners will come from teams that are fixture proof,
Yeah.
but then the variables will be like Gallagher from a team that was in the relegation sort of battle in
Hmm.
the bookies' eyes at the beginning of the season,
Yeah.
and then I would say Brentford, no one really expected them to do much, and now
Hmm.
they're in the sort of position where people have to look at those sorts of options to fill up the gaps.
Yeah.
But there are some teams that I don't even look at the fixtures. Like for instance, if Chelsea or City or Liverpool play anyone but Chelsea, Liverpool or City, I'll just ignore it. I don't
Yeah.
I don't care. You can see because I'm doubling up on Chelsea defenders.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Hey guys, I'm going to stop the video right here just for a sec to actually shout out OneFootball. OneFootball is a fantastic football app that you can actually use as a football fan to make sure you track all the leagues around the world. 160 plus leagues are covered, including all the big leagues such as the Premier League. If you're a fantasy Premier League player, you'll be able to kind of follow all the kind of match day previews, have a look at detailed stats for specific games, and kind of track all the press conference news and injury kind of news around the world. At this international break, of course, you'll be able to kind of track, who's injured, who's ready to play, who's played already, and who might have been, exceptional during the international break. Not only that, but you can also make sure that you can stay up to date with games on a live basis. During the Premier League, when you're actually maybe skipping on games, you can actually track the kind of match updates and maybe have a look at the match ticker and also kind of updated stats that are live for games. So please check it out in the link in the description below. So yeah, I mean, I've actually paired this statistic with kind of an overachievers statistic as well, which basically looks at what we looked at just previously in terms of the fixture difficulty, but then actually comparing to the league position that all these teams are. And I think on the right hand side of this chart, we can see Crystal Palace is clearly the biggest overperformer. Brighton and Wolves being another ones. And then on the other end, we have Leicester and Leeds who've vastly kind of underperformed. Should we start with maybe Crystal Palace? Like, how do you think they've done the season so far, and what do you think makes them so interesting?
I think in terms of tactics, it's difficult to place it, but they've all, I think for the last 5 years they've had a good squad, and I think a lot of people would have said that their previous manager, I can't think of his name right now,
Roy Hodgson. Yeah.
Roy Hodgson, yeah, I think a lot of people when he left the club they kind of praised him for how
Mm-hmm.
efficient he was at managing that team, but
Yeah.
I think Patrice is kind of making more of what they had, and it's quite apparent. It's not just a new manager bounce. I think it's because I don't think that happens at the beginning of the season so much. It's more when there's churn mid-season.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it's a tactical thing that's allowed them to be so efficient. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that I do think that the betting odds are informed by things that have happened in the past, and
Yes.
the general rule with data is things regress eventually. So if you've got the same set of variables and you've got a big change at the same time, then yeah, I don't know how long that will continue.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see Palace being comfortably above 10th at the end of the season, but I still
Okay.
think they're much better than
Interesting.
anyone thought they would be.
Yeah. I think that's a fair point, and that's why I think we can still see them overachieving. Because even if, let's say, you agree that they will place 10th, I think the bookie odds would have placed them close towards relegation at the start of the season. So we can that's why we see them kind of in that kind of +6 territory, right, where it seems like they've overperformed. And I think for me, I would actually disagree and say I think they have had quite a big of a squad overhaul, right? Because I think Gallagher has come in. They've also signed someone like Guehi from Chelsea, bought Anderson as well in the back line. And somehow he's still actually making use of Benteke, but still he's pairing him up with
Yeah.
Edouard as well. I mean, Benteke is someone who I think noticeably over the last 3-4 years has completely dropped off in terms of form, like unable to actually kind of be dominant in set pieces, even though he looks like such a physically kind of predatory figure. And then Zaha, I think most people kind of looking at him as an asset who, wasn't interesting from an FPL point of view, but clearly, when he's faced up against your team, if you're supporting like a big side, you'd be kind of scared of him. But I think, yeah, it's kind of playing this progressive football, which I didn't really envision Crystal Palace being playing, and they're actually dominating. I think most of the mid-table sides. Like I remember watching, the Brighton game, the Leicester game, and Leicester and Brighton are both sides I would think we would expect to dominate Crystal Palace. From a possession point of view, even though Leicester do play predominantly like counter-attacking football where possible, they kind of remind me of someone like Atletico Madrid, where versus the big sides, you'll see them completely park the bus. Versus the mid-table and lower sides, they'll kind of overwhelm them and actually have possession over them. And I think Leicester have been kind of vastly underperforming, whereas Crystal Palace have found a way to play a possession football. And I think he's tried to reduce the kind of age of the squad as well. So we've kind of seen some kind of older players like Milito. I'm sorry, I can't even pronounce the name. Milivojevic.
Milivojevic, I think,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Kind of being filtered out of the squad in place of someone like Gallagher, who is playing centre mid, but has actually found a lot of opportunities to run into the box. So for me, I think definitely Gallagher is a second talisman if you think Zaha's the first one. And I think it makes sense to kind of look at their kind of defenders as well. I think Mitchell is interesting if you actually are looking to replace a player in your team who's around 4.5. But there's a lot of comparisons there, I think, at 4.5 right now, especially with Conte coming into Tottenham. What do you think about West Ham and how well they've done so far? Because I think they're obviously heading into the trickiest part of their season. But I think, especially after watching the Liverpool game, people are extremely high on them and how well they can do it. And you were talking about, teams being fixture proof. Are West Ham arguably fixture proof?
I think they are showing a lot of signs that they are going to grind out results even if one player isn't on the pitch,
Yeah.
which is a good sign. And I think everyone is just, like saying that Brendan Rodgers is, sorry, not Brendan Rodgers. Oh,
David Moyes.
I'm too tired. David Moyes
Yeah,
is doing a really good job, and I do think he's probably one of the best managers in the Premier League at the moment. And the way that he's setting them up allows them to be confident over time, and they're actually managing Europe a lot better than people anticipated they would.
yeah,
So I think they're not fixture proof, but they're underpriced. If Bowen learns how to kind of be a bit more composed and just some strikers take a bit more time to kind of really get that confidence, like Jesse Lingard last season. Um, if he can get a bit of composure, Antonio I think I bought him. I was going to buy him for his 4 goal game 2 years ago, but I didn't. And ever since that, I've watched him, and there's not many players in the world I think that can keep up with him. So some of them are fixture proof to an extent. For instance, if you have Antonio this week, you'd be mad to not play him against Liverpool. I think you'd have to play him, and there aren't many players that are going to perform for the same value over the season. I think they'll be top 5, top 6. So
yeah.
for a team that was almost in relegation 2 years ago, that's fantastic.
No, I agree. And actually, like in my season expectations, I did place West Ham, I think, around fifth stroke sixth. And for me, I think the most interesting thing about them is they've pretty much mastered the kind of way of being able to score in any sort of scenario where you have these kind of defenders and even midfielders who are incredibly oversized, so they can dominate you on set pieces. And even though they actually struggle to hold possession versus most sides, and I think games like, or even if you watch, for example, like over the course of the season, games like the Leeds game, where I think they were mostly getting overwhelmed by Leeds for 60 minutes and then being able to score 2 goals out of nowhere from the last 20 is a good reflection of how West Ham play. So they can really grind a result when nothing is going for them. And the nice thing about owning assets from them is that more than likely they'll come from similar scenarios. So over the last few weeks, we've seen Bowen, for example, take a lot of right-hand side corners, being able to score from that. Cresswell taking left-hand side corners, and kind of getting assists from that. And then he seems to also play the same team every week in the Premier League. And you've mentioned that they've brought in assets to kind of cover themselves in the Europa League. And I think they've actually had a relatively easy time with kind of the group stages over there without having to kind of strain Antonio too much. Someone like Ben Rama, of course, has kind of fallen off the map as a midfielder. Do you think there's any kind of particular reason why he's kind of dropped off in terms of his efficiency?
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the season, I was very close to buying him and Greenwood instead of, I've forgotten what the combination was, but it was something that it was about the same price. It averaged out at like 6.5 each, and
Yeah,
I thought he would be able to do well. No, in no sort of circumstance he would have the same level of kind of service as Antonio,
yeah,
but he would be able to shoot from the kind of the middle of the field when he
hmm,
gets to the
yeah,
box.
exactly.
But I do think that anyone who owned him at the beginning definitely got a little bit lucky. He was in a very kind of confident mood, and West Ham were playing very well. But the chances he gets aren't the striker chances; they are the attacking
Yeah,
mid chances that you have to have a lot of pace on the ball, and it has to be quite far out.
hmm,
So in the sense of an FPL asset, I still think he's pretty good value, especially if you've got him now. He's going to tick along, but I don't think he'll have the same level of like explosive points that he did in game 1 to 5. He's still up there. I don't think there's an enormous amount of actually, I say that Gallagher is probably the one that makes him slightly obsolete
yeah.
at the moment. But yeah, I still think he's a good pick.
No, I agree with that, and I think that's the issue, right? Like you have someone like Smith Rowe, even who, even though he's kind of running into these tough fixtures, you expect him to be a little bit more worthwhile because that kind of cost saving will probably lead to an improvement in a defender. But I think most of the season, what's proven to happen is that the forwards have been incredibly overpriced. And if anything, we need to kind of move away from them, unless you have someone like Kane who could be a potential kind of captaincy alternative. I mean, one side that we haven't really talked about so far in this kind of overachievers and underachievers metric is Aston Villa. They obviously have, Gerrard coming in. Are you interested in any of their assets potentially? Obviously, they have vastly underperformed. I think 5 defeats in a row will show you that. But yeah,
Yeah, I think it was sadly a good time to sack Smith.
hmm,
I think he's actually been quite good for them in terms of their story over the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And I don't think they would have sacked him very readily. But I think for now they're not appealing. I think that they've got a hole in their team that needs time to kind of adjust. Like leaving Grealish last year, he in terms of the big games they won last year that made them into a high profile team to watch, I think Grealish was involved in a lot of those. So the Liverpool game that was, I think it was 7-2 or something.
Yeah.
I think he assisted 3 and scored 2, something crazy. So to kind of lose Grealish, I don't think the manager will completely compensate for that. Gerrard looks good though, from my very novice understanding of Scottish League. So I think he could do well. I think he's a really big draw. He's got a huge fan base, so just the crowd will hype them up. But beyond that, I think on a practical level, they're going to struggle in the same ways that they did before. I don't think Dean Smith's a bad manager. I think they may have just got a big cash sort of release from Grealish, and now they're having to rebuild. So we'll see. But it could be wrong. It could be wrong.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the Lampard scenario where he did exceptionally well when I think the squad was for the most part quite poor, with Lampard only kind of having expectations to make Champions League in the season before he kind of got let go, and him actually performing well with Hazard leaving. And then the next season, they kind of bring in all these kind of reinforcements with Hazard gone, and then Werner, Havertz, etc. come in. And he doesn't know exactly what to do with that side. I think Aston Villa, of course, have bought in a lot of pieces that, in theory, should be good Premier League players. I think we've seen, for example, someone like Leon Bailey do well in a short stint. I think he's been unfortunate with injuries, and then Buendia, I think, has not really found his footing. Although he's been interesting from a set pieces point of view, but that's where you're expecting a lot more from open play from someone like him, and to kind of cover what the missing creativity that Grealish used to bring in was. And then I don't know, like players like McGinn, even Douglas Luiz, for me, should be a part of a decent midfield. The defense, when I actually look at it on paper, doesn't look poor. Maybe Target is maybe an odd one out. Someone who I think defensively is quite poor. I remember kind of watching Watford versus Aston Villa early on in the season, and he really, really struggled versus Sarr. So that kind of tells you where some of their weaknesses might lie. But overall, I think they have, underachieved considering the squad, even though Grealish has left. But I think it's just sometimes the case where you can't find the right identity, even though you have those players. And hopefully Gerrard is someone who can alleviate that. And maybe when he does, I think Matty Cash could be the one interesting option. But, when you're actually looking at it, and for example, I'm looking at your team, if you own James, you own Chilwell, Trent, and Cancelo. I just don't see really how you have space to put someone like Matty Cash or even like Reguilon or Emerson over at Tottenham in your team. It just might not really make too much sense to me. So why don't we actually look at... Oh, sorry. Did you want to say something?
I think it just because we touched on the back five originally, I think it's a really difficult position to move away from. The double Chelsea or double City plus Trent, and then Livramento, if you got him at 4.2, then you've got a very cheap enabler and then 4 undervalued players that are playing for the best teams. So as long as they're not rotated, I can't see value in a Reguilon or a kind of a Cash or I think it's for me. I can't see myself switching now unless there's injuries or something has changed. But
no, completely agree with you. Why don't we actually move on to shot creating actions per 90? Because for me, this is a key statistic that basically outlines how creative a specific side is. And just as we were kind of talking about a team like West Ham, for example, they're obviously overperforming in a little bit because we don't see them too high in these kind of shot creating action stats. And I think part of that too is, when you can actually score set pieces, those actually don't rate very highly in terms of expected goal statistics or even shot creation. So I can see them kind of being a little bit lower compared to the league position there. A lot of the teams I think here make sense in terms of their position and relative to kind of where they performed the season. But clearly, we've seen that Tottenham is the massive outlier here, I think, in the statistic. Do you think Conte can alleviate that, or do you think it's more of a situation with the squad where when I look at that midfield, for example, the only player that I'm really interested in terms of creativity is Ndombele. But the question, of course, always is how do you actually fit him into the side? Yeah.
I think it absolutely can happen with Spurs. I think they've got a very skillful front two, and Mora is good also. I think their midfield is good enough, and I think that their centre backs have been refreshed this year. So they've got Sanchez and Brazilian player as well. I've forgotten his name, but he was signed for about 30 mil this year. So they don't lack talent, and just their first 11 is more than sort of 17 teams or 16 teams in the leagues, full squads. So I don't think they have a talent, a sort of undersupply of talent. I think Conte will struggle because it's just humans that he has to manage, people, and he'll get to know them, the dynamic, and have to work and make them flow. But I think he can do it, and I think poor Nuno, because he looked so depressed towards the end. But I think Conte's a lot tougher in the sense of he will grind out results. He's obsessed with winning, and I think he'll push them hard. So I think he'll make a team that's on paper very good. He'll make that closer to what it was a couple of years ago, I think. And I'm not a Spurs fan. I'll just throw that out there. I think I just think that's what it appears to be. It seems like United would have gone for Conte if Spurs hadn't had him. So I think that he's the good pick for them.
Yeah. I think the interesting about Conte, though, is, when people kind of reflect on that Chelsea season where he turned things around and moved from a back four to a back three, it took around maybe 5-6 games before that actually happened. And he made that kind of educated decision to move into a back three, which for some reason, the entire Premier League just completely were unable to stop. And the interesting thing for me is, we've all kind of picked Spurs assets a little bit earlier before that, expecting that he can find the right kind of solution early on. And I actually think he can. I think he did actually start playing with a 3-4-3 where, Lucas Moura plays as his kind of third piece up top. And I wonder if it makes more sense to actually opt for something like a 3-5-2 where at least you can play Ndombele as a 10-ish as part of the midfield. And that gives you a little bit more dynamicism over someone like the pairing, I think, so far that we've seen of Skip and Højbjerg, which has been very, very tame, very unaggressive, very, very passive at times, with very dead possession as well. I'm not sure if he'll actually move into that. This is obviously my very uneducated kind of tactical opinion on things. I'm sure there's a reason why he's playing in this 3-4-3, and maybe he'll find the right pieces to actually find creativity. But I think it is quite an alarming statistic, mostly kind of colored by the fact that Nuno was constantly changing tactics, I think, from game to game with no kind of real identity being set in place. But we all kind of, I think, expect Conte, based on his track record, to do well. So I think they're a team that will probably find themselves higher up there. And another team that actually kind of strikes out to me as being quite interesting in terms of their position for shot creating actions is a team like Southampton, for example, where I think once again we probably expected them to be probably close to a relegation team. Losing Danny Ings at the start of the season, not really getting much back. I know they brought in Armstrong, but I think they also kind of dominate sides. I think possession wise, I'm kind of reminded of like someone like Gineppo, who is a very, very kind of, I think, technical winger. I wouldn't say creative because he doesn't really do much with the ball when he has it. But he's able to keep possession of it. And they kind of have a side where I think they're just missing the quality, right, to kind of capitalize on that. And that's why I think when we look at Livramento, this is something you actually brought up to me before we started the podcast. But, people are talking about Livramento as an attacking winger. And yes, when you look at his heat maps, yes, he occupies very kind of offensive positions up in the field, but he doesn't really actually have any kind of effective opportunities to create and make that kind of reflect into goals. I think I'm reminded of the one chance that Gineppo actually missed, which was a tap-in versus Newcastle. But beyond that, I think that's one of the kind of glaring things with Southampton, where I think people have somewhat overrated how interesting they can be from an offensive point of view. How do you feel about Southampton?
I think it's surprising to see them where they. Well, actually, no. You know what? I could just say that, but it's just pretty much where I expected them, bang in the middle. I think the best opportunities on that side are probably Livramento, which is pretty obvious at this point.
Yeah,
I think the bonus point system will favour him going forward, so that's another thing to keep in mind. He won't attack in the same way that the top four wing backs will, but he's so cheap. If you've got him at 4.5 or less, then he's still good
yeah,
value. And I think they're doing as I expected, and then perhaps there's Adams as well at the front. But I wouldn't. In fact, I actually think McCarthy. But you alluded to earlier, if you've got Livramento, there's not much sense in having McCarthy. But I think he would also be another good option if Livramento wasn't owned by half of the game. So yeah, I think they're doing pretty well. I think Hasenhüttl's definitely allowing them to overachieve, and in some ways he's proven, and I think he would be good wherever he goes. So, but yeah, they're not going to score from the kind of same volume as Chelsea or City. I think it will be far less.
yeah. I think just in terms of creation, obviously it leads into actually like goals, and I think if we look at goals, kind of minus expected goals, this is a good statistic to kind of show maybe how clinical a team is, but also, as you say, with statistics, we do expect regression at one point, and that's where I think I was kind of raising the point of how Southampton are a very unimpressive team in terms of how clinical they are, and we can see them at the complete bottom of this sort of table here, where it shows they're very, very unclinical. And I think that's it just goes back to the point where we should basically respect most of the top four teams in terms of their production. I think United being up there is a little bit alarming to me because I think they actually haven't scored many goals, which basically tells me that their expected goal this metric is probably quite low this season compared to where we expect them to be. And other than that, I think most of the teams, surprisingly, I think City and Tottenham are also near the kind of bottom end of the table. So do you think there's going to be more to come from City? Because this is the first season, and I remember you telling me, they rank below Liverpool in expected goals, at least so far. So do you think there's been a monumental change within the way City operate their attack, or is it just because I think Liverpool have actually found their footing from a defensive point of view this season?
I had an opinion at the beginning of the season that Liverpool were always comfortably going to finish top three,
Yeah,
and I think it's pretty obvious now that they're very close to the City and Chelsea. Chelsea are showing a lot of grit, so they might not be producing the same level of output as City, but they're actually fighting every time they get the ball,
yeah,
and they're trying very hard on the ball. So like you were saying, they are overperforming, and that's one because of skill, but two because of hard work. And I think same with Liverpool and same with City. I think City are now working more on sort of Grealish's kind of he's getting a lot of minutes, and on that wing if you contrast him to someone like Sterling that would have been on that wing 2 years ago,
mm-hmm.
they've changed their tactics from speedy wingers to
Yeah,
dribbling into the progression of the ball. So
yeah,
I think that at the end of the season, I think it will be a dead heat with those three. I think United have basically written off this season because
yeah.
they've lost too many points, and there's now a huge. I read in the news today, Ollie's got the sack. Apparently, I don't know if that's 100% confirmed, but I
Yeah,
think it's very likely. So they've got some turbulent times ahead, and they're already 5 or 6 points, 7 points, but below Arsenal. So I think, so yeah, so it'll be those three at the top. I don't see anyone closing the gap at all. I think Chelsea will allow, like just their hard work, but if in terms of opinion, and I guess backed up by stats, I think City are the most technically complete team, but Chelsea beat them in the UCL final because they wanted it more. So we'll see.
yeah. I mean, I think the thing with Chelsea is even though they actually have maybe a side that you can say can dominate teams from a possession point of view, I think a game like Newcastle is where you can see they overwhelm teams by possession, really. I think between the lines Twitter post really accurately reflects how they're able to beat Newcastle in that game, if anyone's interested. But with Chelsea, I think I'm reminded of, the Liverpool game being a good example of what happens when that team is facing adversity. And yes, it's obviously an undersold kind of fact in football where I think team cohesion is definitely something that factors in well. I think this Chelsea side remind me of how confident the Liverpool side was when they were trying to kind of reclaim the Champions League after losing to Real Madrid. That kind of squad cohesion is very important. And when you're talking about City, I agree. Yeah, it seems like Grealish has gotten a lot of minutes and he hasn't probably produced as much. But on the same flank, we've seen someone like Cancelo actually deliver a lot, which is interesting, right? Because I think now we've moved into the point where I think every season Pep finds maybe one or two players who become talismans that we don't expect. Bernardo Silva playing centre mid several years ago was kind of a big example of that. I think he's kind of reproducing similar levels of performances now, but Cancelo is moving into that kind of territory where he becomes that kind of piece. And I think with City, you just kind of have to ride with those pieces, when you see them. And right now, I think it's probably going to be Cancelo. If we actually look at maybe a statistic such as, expected goals against versus minus goals conceded, I think this is a good statistic to show how well a keeper is doing potentially, but it's also a kind of a reflection on how good a team's defense is, and that includes the midfield as well. We've seen Chelsea do exceptionally well so far. Arsenal is doing exceptionally well too, and we probably wouldn't have expected that after the start of the season, but you of course can't get carried away with just one performance versus Brentford. But a lot of the teams here reflect a lot of the ownership of I think the keepers in FPL, with exception to someone like Guaita from Crystal Palace, who ranks pretty far down the bottom. What do you actually think about the keepers this season, and what do you actually think about defense? I know some people have actually found money to kind of put into Mendy, but I suppose having these fullbacks at much cheaper prices doesn't really make too much sense to own Mendy, I think, over the course of the season. Arsenal, of course, I think is mostly reflective of how well Ramsdale has done, and also the impact of Gabriel coming back into the side post-injury, and then Tomiyasu being brought in as a right back. Should we start with maybe Arsenal? What do you think about them as a defensive team in general, and then also Ramsdale?
I think Arsenal this season will continue to be I think people forget that their team is worth best part of £1 billion, so they can pull something out of the bag. They've got a very expensive backline that's got pace, and they've got an expensive midfield that's got pace. So there's no reason why they can't continue to keep this up. If it was someone like Crystal Palace, I would be looking at what's possible at the moment, but I'll also be sort of I guess hedging my sort of expectations and not expecting 12 or 11 players to have the seasons of their lives and be massively undervalued on the sort of transfer market.
Yeah.
I think Arsenal will come through. I think Ramsdale is it's a brave choice for a club that is lacking confidence to get a young goalie, because that's one of the most nervous jobs. It's all or nothing. It's you could get the most blame out of any game. So he's done very well for a keeper that's like 23. And I think in terms of just FPL, I think he's a season keeper. I think if you've got him at 4.5 or 4.6, he's going to consistently get bonus points. You can tell that when there's an app called FPL Alerts, and you can just track the bonus points throughout the game. You can track it with all the keepers. Just kind of take a loose note, and he'll stand out every game, even if they're a goal down, or even if there's been a haul from some of the outfielders. He'll still place well in there, and even if he's just out, it's a good indication he's going to get it on the games where it's a low scoring game. So in terms of FPL, I think he's the best keeper this year.
Yeah, I think there's no question. And the thing about Southampton as well is just, if you already own Livramento, I mean, I always say it just doesn't make sense to hold a pairing from a bottom half team or even a mid-table team. And I know Brighton ranks well up there, but we were kind of talking about bonus points early on once again with Sanchez, and this is the season for him to get bonus points because he has that ownership, and Dunk is no longer stealing as many points as he used to from him. Not only that, but I think, when we look at the defense of Brighton this season, I actually think I've been a little bit underwhelmed just from the eye test from Sanchez, which is actually why I've made the decision to actually go out of him, my team. Part of that too is the fact that Guaita has actually come out of this run with, I think, 12 points over Sanchez, or maybe around 7 points. And you wouldn't expect that because Crystal Palace have already faced, Chelsea, Liverpool, City, all the tough fixtures possible. And for the foreseeable run until my next wild card, I can probably live with Guaita as a big differential. Yep, sorry.
So no, I was just trying to refocus my camera. I wasn't trying to butt in.
That's all good.
No, I completely agree. I think if you're in a position where you've only got a couple of 100k or point million in the bank, then
Yeah,
Guaita is certainly good enough to fill in the place of Sanchez. I do think over the course of the season, Brighton has got one of the best defenses, and he is now starting to get bonus points. I think he'll continue to. I think there's no other position in the game that's more relevant for bonus points than keepers.
Yeah.
I think with midfielders and strikers, you can pretty much disregard the points because they'll come. But with the last 2 years of keepers, it's been crucial of picking one that gets bonus. And I think Sanchez has finally opened up kind of bonus. I don't think he got a single bonus point last year, and he's already on 4 or 5. So it's a good indication that if he gets, if they return closer to the medium of what they're capable of doing, he should do well over the year. But Guaita, purely off of the fact that they have at the moment got decent stability, then he could do well. I just think Brighton have got about 16 months of solid sort of backline defense, whereas Palace at the moment are working off about 4, 5, 6 weeks of data. So for me personally, I think I would default to Sanchez, especially if I already owned him. And then if I could afford Ramsdale, I would take the hit and do that.
I agree with that. I've obviously done that because I had to get Cancelo on my team, and I'm trying to save up some money for Ronaldo eventually, but it'll probably be a big move not owning Ramsdale for most of the season. Probably going to be a huge differential either way for me. Probably a bad one, just because I actually think I agree Ramsdale is maybe even the best keeper in the league just from the eye test. But we'll see. I mean, obviously, you have players like Schmeichel here for Leicester City, and I wouldn't say from the eye test that he's one of the worst keepers in the league. So this metric, of course, needs more data as per usual. And not only that, it's colored by the fact that I think Leicester have changed their backline on a weekly basis, so that's not a great stat.
Absolutely, they've had a lot of switching, so
exactly,
I'm not surprised about that.
If we move away from the teams and just look to close off with just players, how do you feel about captaincy this week? Is it just set and forget Salah once again for you, or is there anyone driving your decision making?
Yeah, I'm going to just stick with Salah as captain. The only thing that I feel like sways me slightly is that I have Jota in my team, which you may have seen.
Yeah.
I brought him in over the international break. It's really poor play from my side, but I think I brought him in about probably about 10 days in. So he played all of his games. He played his games, so he was safe. But I just clicked the button. I was tired of thinking about it, so I went for it. I think in that instance, if you've got 2 Liverpool wingers, you can perhaps look elsewhere. There's an argument that you're overly reliant on a team that has to score against Arsenal, who don't look bad. And in the event that you want to go for someone else, for me, I would go for. I honestly think Son right now looks like a better player, and just to own him for FPL, not in an actual football sense, but I just think that he is 2 mil cheaper, and I have him in my team, so that's the only other consideration.
Yeah. Better player than Kane, right? Not Salah.
No, Salah is the best player in FPL by a mile. So I think that's why I'm picking him. But as I say, if it's a 1-0 and Ketia scores, then I've got Jota and Salah soaking up 20 mil of budget with 0 points. So it's you can. I would, but still, I think if you've got Salah, captain him because he is fixture proof and he is essential, which is very, very rare. But he is essential. You will do badly if you don't have Salah this year. So
I think that's proven to be the case. That Kai Havertz captaincy week is the biggest example of that.
I do feel for people in that one, but I think, yeah, you kind of roll with the punches. I don't think that it was a poor idea. I think
No.
I can understand why people would have done it, but you got absolutely ruined that week. So you just
Yeah.
have to pick up the pieces and move on. Um, can't fault the judgment. I think just own the decision and move on with it. I think it's not the end of the world. Just have fun with it.
Yeah. It's like me not going for Cancelo, because basically my plan was always to get Cancelo this week, no hits, before the Sanchez red card. And then obviously he holds versus United, which was unexpected, but then again, not unexpected because United have been very terrible this season. It's just that you expect them to kind of park the bus versus City, which for some reason they didn't do for the first time in 2 years, maybe. But things happen like that, and they did the same thing with Liverpool, where I think once again he played with a very loose kind of 4-2-4 structure, where the wingers just weren't supporting the midfields. They looked very, very open, to be honest, on the wings, and very susceptible between the lines, and that's been the kind of like the hallmark of United this season. For me though, like captaincy wise, I obviously have Kane. I don't think anyone should be doubling up on Kane and Son, but if you do have Kane or if you do have Son, I think it's still a viable captaincy shout. I think when you look at defense metrics, yes, Arsenal and these actually kind of average out each other, and you definitely look towards Liverpool because they're creating much more chances and seem to be definitely a fixture-proof team. Salah's a fixture-proof player. For me, though, I think Leeds do seem to be more open versus these bigger sides that have the personnel to kind of beat them, because individually, I think, Son, we've seen him score, I think, a poker versus Leeds before. And we've seen, for example, Leeds get destroyed by a relatively poor United side as well. So when these kind of big sides with big players with Kane and Son inside have the chance to fight versus Leeds, I think they really do get collapsed, and the way they play so openly leaves them to be quite susceptible. I do think there's a decent reason to captain Kane, but I think at this point in time, because the Spurs assets don't have high ownership, it's already good enough of a differential. It's not like captaining Antonio, right? A lot of people have Antonio still. He probably is around 70% ownership, maybe even 80%. So captaining him is always interesting in some weeks. I'm not talking about this week, but just in general. Whereas Kane and Son, I think their ownership is still around the 20 to 30% range maximally, even in the top 10K. So for me, I think it makes more sense to play it safer. And there's no reason to play it safer than having Salah, who's basically in Ballon d'Or form. Yeah.
Yeah, I sometimes think to myself, if they were just numbers and they didn't have, different colored shirts, and I didn't know where the stadium was, I'd probably make different decisions. So,
Right.
in the event of Kane, who's got 1 goal and 1 assist, and then imagine you take the shirt away and the haircut, and they're just two spreadsheet cells, and one's got 10 goals and 7 assists. I just find it very hard to back Harry Kane. I think he, like you say, is a differential on his own. I think just having him will. I think people underestimate how much of a difference it will make, even if you're at a very high rank. Having some of these players that will perform. So, I think for this week, the sensible players came. But if you have a very kind of clear feeling that you think someone else is going to outperform, then go for it. But for me, I think he's on 120 points. I think he can do anything. He City is, in my opinion, is second best team in the world after Bayern, maybe, and Salah hauled against them. So I think they'll do the same this weekend. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, actually, Cancelo was maybe the outside shout for a captaincy. A little bit of an edgy pick. What do you think about him? Yeah,
I think he's got a very good chance of a clean sheet. I think it's 65% plus.
Yeah,
so
I think highest potential this week. Yeah,
and that would beat Salah's 2 last week. So I think there's a conversation for that if you want to be safe. But again, you're discounting a guy that's 120 points, so you've got to be sure. That's the only way I'll say it.
Yeah, agree. All right. Well, thank you so much, Pete, for joining the podcast. Lovely to have you on. Do you have any kind of final words?
Join the Discord.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, cheers, Fran, and good luck, everyone.
Yeah.